The cargo freighter moved through the darkness of space like a tired metal bird searching for its nest. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair and watched the stars drift past the main window, while his fingers tapped against the armrest in a steady rhythm that matched his breathing. He had been flying this route for 15 years, and knew every asteroid and every empty patch of nothing between the stations, but today felt different somehow. Lisa Grant stood at the navigation panel and checked their course for the third time, in an hour, because she was the kind of person who believed that careful checking prevented disasters. Danny Cole worked in the engine room below and hummed old songs from Earth while he made sure their ship kept moving forward through the void. The three of them had flown together for so long that they barely needed to talk anymore, and could read each other's moods just by listening to how someone breathed. The alarm sounded like a scream in the quiet ship, and Jake sat up straight while his heart jumped in his chest. Lisa's hands flew across her controls and her face went pale in the blue light from her screens. A distress beacon was broadcasting from somewhere close by, and the signal was weak and stuttering like a dying voice calling for help. Jake looked at the readings and saw that the signal came from a ship that was not human, and not any design he recognized from the usual trading partners. Lisa turned to face him, and her expression said that she already knew what he would decide. They were 3 days from the nearest station, and their cargo hold was full of medical supplies that were needed but not urgently needed. If they diverted to investigate the distress call, they would be late, and the company would dock their pay. But Jake had never been the kind of man who could ignore someone crying for help in the darkness. He gave the order and Lisa changed their course while Danny grumbled over the intercom about how helping strangers usually led to trouble and extra work for him. The ship turned and headed toward the source of the beacon, and Jake felt that old, familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he made a decision that might get them all killed. Space was dangerous and full of things that wanted to hurt you, and sometimes the smart choice was to mind your own business and keep flying. But Jake had never been particularly smart about these things. The alien ship appeared on their screens. After 20 minutes of flying, and it was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are. The hull was made of something that looked like crystal or glass, and it caught the light from distant stars and threw it back in colors that Jake did not have names for. But the ship was clearly damaged, with huge cracks running through the crystal, and pieces missing where something had torn through the structure with violence and purpose. Jake put on his pressure suit and grabbed his emergency kit while Lisa matched speed with the drifting vessel. Danny came up from the engine room and handed Jake a portable oxygen unit and a scanner and told him to be careful and not to touch anything that looked like it might explode. Jake nodded and moved to the airlock while his heart beat faster, and his hands went through the familiar motions of checking seals and testing equipment. The alien ship was cold inside, and the air was thin and smelled like flowers mixed with copper. Jake's suit lights cut through the darkness and showed walls that curved in strange angles and corridors that seemed to spiral in directions that made his eyes hurt. He followed the beacon signal deeper into the ship and called out in universal language, which was the trade tongue that most spacefaring species understood even if they did not speak it well. A voice answered him, and it was weak and full of pain, and Jake moved faster through the twisted corridors until he found the medical bay. The room was larger than it should have been based on the ship's external size, and Jake decided not to think too hard about alien geometry and dimensional tricks. What mattered was the scene in front of him. A tall alien lay on the floor, and her body was broken in ways that made Jake look away quickly. She had skin that looked like cloudy crystal, and eyes that were too large and filled with tears that sparkled like diamonds. 3 small aliens huddled against the far wall, and they were clearly children based on their size and the way they clung to each other. The dying alien reached toward Jake with one trembling hand and spoke in broken universal. She told him that her name was Thelaris and that she was a Verdani, which was a species Jake had heard about in passing at various space stations. The Verdani were known as peaceful people who studied science and art and never bothered anyone. Thelaris explained that their colony ship had been carrying families to a new world when they were attacked by hunters called the Kresh, who were predators that killed for sport and pleasure. The adult Verdani had fought to give the children time to escape, but their escape pod had malfunctioned and crashed into the ship's medical bay instead of launching into space. Thelaris had been injured trying to protect the young ones, and now she was dying, and there was nothing Jake could do to stop it. She looked at him with those huge crystal eyes and begged him to take the children and keep them safe, because the creche would come back to finish what they started. Jake knelt beside her and promised that he would protect them, and Thalaris seemed to relax a little bit before the light went out of her eyes. Jake stood slowly and turned to look at the 3 young Verdani who watched him with terror and confusion written on their small faces. The oldest one was maybe equivalent to a human 10-year-old, and she had her arms wrapped around 2 smaller children who might have been 6 and 4 in human terms. Jake spoke softly and told them his name and that he was going to take them somewhere safe. The children did not move, and Jake realized they probably did not understand much universal yet. He slowly removed his helmet so they could see his face, and he smiled the way his mother used to smile when he had nightmares as a boy. The oldest child whispered something to the younger ones, and they slowly came forward while Jake gathered them close and led them back through the dead ship toward his waiting vessel. Lisa met them at the airlock, and her eyes went wide when she saw the children, but she did not ask questions and instead helped Jake get them settled in the crew quarters. Danny brought them water and emergency ration bars and muttered about how this was definitely going to be trouble. Jake stood on the bridge and looked at the scanner readings and felt ice form in his stomach. 4 ships had just entered the system, and they were moving fast, and their design matched nothing in the friendly databases. The lead ship sent a transmission, and Jake opened the channel. A face appeared on the screen, and it was all sharp teeth and cold eyes and predatory hunger. The creature spoke in perfect universal and identified himself as Vask of the Creche hunting pack. Vask said that the Verdani children belonged to him by right of hunt, and that Jake should hand them over immediately, or face the consequences of interfering with Creche business. Jake looked at the screen, and then looked back at the crew quarters, where 3 terrified children huddled together, and something old and fierce woke up in his chest. Jake stared at the face on his screen and felt something cold settle into his bones that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature controls. Vask looked like someone had taken a lizard and a wolf and somehow merged them into something that walked upright and killed for pleasure. His scales were dark green and black, and his eyes were yellow with vertical slits that tracked movement, with the focus of something that had spent millions of years learning how to hunt. The Creche commander tilted his head in a way that reminded Jake of a bird examining a bug before eating it. Vask explained that his pack had been hunting the Verdani colony ship for 3 days, and that the adults had provided good sport before they died. The children were the last remaining prey, and Creche tradition demanded that hunts be completed properly. He spoke about it the way someone might discuss a business transaction or a hobby, and Jake felt his hands curl into fists. Vask continued talking and said that humans were unknown to the Creche and that this first contact did not need to end badly. Jake could simply hand over the children and be on his way, and the Creche would remember that humans were wise enough not to interfere in matters that did not concern them. The 4 warships moved closer, and Jake could see weapons arrays that would turn his small freighter into vapor in seconds. Jake took a slow breath and let it out and said no. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Vask stopped talking and his eyes narrowed. The Creche commander asked if Jake understood the situation, and Jake said that he understood it just fine, and his answer was still no. Vask leaned forward, and his teeth showed in what might have been a smile, or might have been a threat display. The Creche explained their philosophy, which they called the Doctrine of Fang, and it was simple and brutal. The strong hunted the weak, and that was the natural order of things, and anyone who tried to stand between predator and prey became prey themselves. Vask said that the Creche had been apex predators on their world, and now they were apex predators in space, and no species had ever successfully challenged them. Jake listened, and his jaw got tighter and tighter until his teeth hurt. When Vask finished talking, Jake said that he did not care about Creche philosophy or Creche tradition. The children were under his protection now, and if Vask wanted them, he would have to go through Jake first. Lisa made a small sound behind him, and Danny's voice came over the intercom asking if Jake had lost his mind. Vask sat back and studied Jake like he was something interesting and unexpected. He said that most species ran or surrendered when they met the Creche, and that very few chose to fight. He offered Jake one more chance to reconsider, and explained that the Creche ships had enough firepower to destroy the freighter 20 times over. Jake could die here for no reason, or he could live and continue his life and forget about 3 alien children he had just met. Jake felt Lisa's hand on his shoulder, and she was trying to pull him away from the screen. She whispered that they needed to talk about this and that she understood he wanted to help, but they were just a cargo ship. Danny came up from the engine room and stood in the doorway and said that their shields would last maybe 2 minutes, under crash weapons, and that they had families waiting for them back home. Jake turned away from the screen and looked at his crew and saw fear and concern and love because they were more than just co-workers after 15 years together. He walked to the crew quarters and opened the door and saw the 3 Verdani children sitting on the floor. The oldest one had her arms around the 2 smaller ones, and they were all crying silent tears that left crystal trails down their faces. The youngest child looked up at Jake, and his eyes were huge and terrified and full of trust that Jake did not deserve. The boy did not understand what was happening, but he knew that the tall human had helped them when their caretaker died, and children were good at knowing who would protect them and who would not. Jake felt something break open in his chest, and it was fierce and protective and completely unreasonable. He walked back to the bridge, and his crew saw his face, and Lisa let out a long breath, and Danny shook his head, but neither of them argued anymore. Jake stood in front of the screen where Vask waited with patient predatory confidence. Jake said that he had thought about the offer, and his answer was the same. The children were under his protection, and Vask could back off or find out why humans had earned the right to walk upright. On a world full of predators, Vask's expression changed, and something like respect flickered in those yellow eyes. He said that the pack accepted Jake's challenge, and that they would enjoy hunting a species with courage even if that courage was foolish. Jake said that courage and foolishness looked the same from the outside, and only the result showed which one it had been. Vask laughed, and it sounded like rocks grinding together. The transmission cut, and the 4 Kresh warships began to move into attack positions. Lisa ran to her station and started calculating escape vectors, while Danny's voice shouted updates about power distribution and shield strength. Jake sat in his command chair and felt calm settle over him like a familiar coat. He had made his choice, and now he just had to see it through to whatever end waited for them. The first attack came fast and brutal, and the ship shook like someone had grabbed it and tried to tear it apart. Plasma bolts hammered their shields, and the lights flickered, and alarms screamed. Danny yelled that they had lost 30% shield strength in the first volley, and at this rate they had maybe 5 minutes before the shields collapsed completely. Lisa found an escape vector that might work, but it required flying through an asteroid field, and their chances of making it through without hitting something were not good. Jake shook his head and said they were not running. Lisa turned to stare at him and asked what exactly he planned to do against 4 warships with a cargo freighter that had 1 mining laser and prayers. Jake smiled, and it was not a nice smile. He said that predators got comfortable when they always hunted things that ran away, and that sometimes the best defense was doing something so stupid that the other side did not see it coming. He turned the ship and flew directly at the nearest Kresh warship, and Lisa grabbed her console, and Danny's voice rose 3 octaves over the intercom. The Kresh ship hesitated because prey did not fly toward predators, and in that moment of confusion, Jake did something that every cargo pilot learned in training. He opened the cargo bay doors and activated the emergency ejection system. Dozens of shipping containers shot out into space directly into the path of the Kresh warship at high velocity. The Kresh pilot tried to dodge, and his ship broke formation, and Jake fired their mining laser at the exposed engine port. The beam was meant for cutting apart asteroids, and it burned through the engine casing like paper. The Kresh ship went dark and started tumbling through space with its systems. Dead and 1 down meant 3 to go. The other Kresh ships pulled back, and Jake could almost feel Vask's surprise through the void of space. The comm channel opened, and Vask said that Jake was clever, but that he had only made the hunt more satisfying. The Kresh would take their time now and tear Jake's ship apart piece by piece and make him watch the children die before he followed them into darkness. Jake did not answer with words. Instead, he turned off the translator and made a sound deep in his throat that started as a growl and rose into something that his ancestors had made when they faced down wolves and bears with nothing but sharpened sticks. It was a challenge and a threat and a promise all rolled into one primal sound. Then Jake opened the channel and spoke in universal again. He told Vask that humans came from a world where everything wanted to kill them, and that they had spent millions of years learning how to kill back. He said that humans had hunted animals that weighed tons using persistence and cunning, and that they had looked at every predator on their planet and decided they were higher on the food chain. Jake said that when humans decided Something was under their protection. They did not negotiate, and they did not surrender. They bared their teeth, and they fought, and they made you regret ever threatening what was theirs. His voice was calm and cold and absolutely certain. The 3 remaining Kresh warships circled Jake's freighter like sharks that had smelled blood in the water and were deciding which angle to attack from. Jake flew through the debris field left by the shipping containers and tried to keep moving, because stationary targets died fast in space combat. Lisa worked her navigation console with hands that shook slightly, and Danny kept shouting updates about shield strength and power levels that got worse with each passing second. The second wave of attacks came from 2 directions at once, and Jake barely managed to roll the ship in time to avoid a plasma barrage that would have cut through their engines. The shields flared bright blue and then flickered, and Danny's voice cracked when he said they were down to 40% and losing power to the port side generators. Jake asked how long until total shield failure, and Danny said maybe 10 minutes if they were lucky and 5 if they were not. Jake flew toward an asteroid field that showed up on the long-range sensors, and Lisa said that was a terrible idea because the asteroids were too dense and their ship was too big to maneuver between them safely. Jake said that the Kresh ships were bigger and less maneuverable, and that sometimes you had to take the terrible idea over the definitely fatal alternative. Lisa stopped arguing and started plotting the safest path through the asteroids, which was like trying to find the least sharp knife in a drawer full of blades. The freighter entered the asteroid field, and immediately things got worse. Jake had to dodge left and right and up and down in 3-dimensional space, while rocks the size of buildings tumbled past close enough to scrape their hull. The Kresh followed, but they were slower and less agile, and Jake heard Vask screaming orders over an open channel that the human pilot must have accidentally left active. One of the Kresh ships clipped an asteroid and spun sideways, and Jake took the opportunity to fire his mining laser at its weapon arrays. The beam carved through the systems, and the Kresh ship went quiet with its guns disabled. 2 down and 2 to go, but Jake's ship was dying, and everyone on the bridge knew it. The shield display showed red across all sections, and the hull integrity warnings were scrolling faster than Lisa could read them. They broke free of the asteroid field, and Jake saw open space ahead, which should have been good news but meant they had nowhere left to hide. The 2 remaining Kresh warships came out of the asteroids behind them, and their weapons charged up with a sound that the freighter's sensors translated into a rising whine. Lisa found a nebula on the edge of the system and said they could hide there if they could reach it before the shields failed completely. Jake pushed the engines past their safety limits, and the ship groaned and shuddered like something alive that was being hurt. Danny yelled that they were burning out the power couplings and that if they did not stop soon, the whole engine assembly would melt down. Jake said they only needed 5 more minutes, and Danny said they did not have 5 more minutes. And then the shields failed completely, and the first plasma bolt hit the rear hull. The ship lurched sideways, and Jake tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue. Alarms screamed about hull breaches in sections 4 and 5, and the automatic bulkheads sealed to contain the damage. Lisa's console sparked and went dark, and she switched to the backup station while her hands moved with the kind of speed that came from years of practice. The nebula was close, but not close enough. Another plasma bolt hit, and this time it tore through the cargo bay and blew out the rear doors. The ship began venting atmosphere and spinning, and Jake fought the controls to stabilize while his heart hammered against his ribs. Danny somehow got the emergency thrusters online, and they managed to stop the spin, but now they were tumbling toward the nebula with no shields and no maneuvering power. The Kresh ships held their fire, and Jake realized they were playing with him now. Vask opened a channel and said that Jake had fought well for prey, but that the hunt was over. He offered one final chance to surrender the children and receive a quick death, instead of being left to die slowly as the ship's life support failed. Jake looked at the damage reports and the power readings and knew that Vask was right about their situation. He turned his chair and looked back at the crew quarters, where the 3 Verdani children huddled together in the darkness. The oldest girl had her face pressed against the small window, and she was watching him, and Jake saw that she understood what was happening. She was old enough to know when adults were preparing to give up, and she was old enough to be terrified of what came next. Jake turned back to the screen and said no for what felt like the 100th time. Vask actually looked surprised and asked what Jake hoped to accomplish by continuing this pointless resistance. Jake said that he was not trying to accomplish anything except keeping his promise to protect 3 kids who had already lost everything. Vask said that was not logical, and Jake agreed and said that humans were not particularly logical when it came to protecting children. The Kresh commander studied him and something shifted in those yellow predator eyes. Vask said that he was beginning to understand why humans had survived on a dangerous world, and that perhaps they were more than simple prey. He said it was unfortunate that this first meeting between Kresh and humans had to end with Jake's death because future encounters might have been interesting. Jake said that Vask was making assumptions about how this was going to end. The freighter finally reached the nebula and drifted into the purple and blue clouds that would hide their thermal signature at least temporarily. Jake shut down everything except life support and emergency systems, and the ship went quiet and dark. Lisa worked on trying to restore some functionality to the navigation systems, and Danny climbed through the damaged sections with repair tools and prayer. The children stayed in the crew quarters and did not make any sound. Jake sat in his command chair and felt exhaustion settle into his bones like poison. He had not slept in 30 hours and his body hurt in places he did not know could hurt. Lisa came and sat beside him and asked what they were going to do now. Jake said he did not know, and that felt like the first completely honest thing he had said in hours. She asked if he regretted his decision, and Jake thought about it and said no without hesitation. Danny came back to the bridge and his face was covered in grease and his hands were bandaged where he had burned them on hot metal. He said that he had managed to get the jump drive partially functional, and they had maybe one jump left if they were lucky, but it would probably kill the engines permanently. Jake asked how long until the Kresh found them, and Danny said maybe 2 hours based on their search pattern. The three of them sat in the darkness and listened to the ship creak and groan around them. Lisa said that they could use the escape pods to send the crew away and let the Kresh have the children, and at least some people would survive. Jake said no. Danny suggested they could hide just the children in a pod with stealth coating and hope it drifted far enough away before being detected. Jake said no to that too. His crew stared at him and Lisa asked what exactly he expected to happen. Jake said he did not expect anything except that he would not give up those children while he still had breath in his body. Danny asked if Jake was prepared to die for 3 alien kids he had just met, and Jake said yes without blinking. Lisa made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and said that she had always known her captain was crazy, but this was a new level. Jake stood up and walked to the crew quarters and opened the door. The 3 Verdani children looked at him with their huge crystal eyes, and the youngest one got up and walked over and wrapped his small arms around Jake's leg. The captain knelt down and gathered all 3 children close and felt them trembling against him.
He did not speak because
he had no words that would make this better, and sometimes silence was more honest than false comfort. The oldest girl looked up at him and said something in her own language that Jake did not understand. Then she switched to broken universal and asked why he was doing this. She said that they were not his people and that he could leave them and save himself. Jake tried to figure out how to explain and finally just said that where he came from, you helped people who needed help, and it did not matter if they were your people or not. The girl thought about that and nodded slowly. She said that the Verdani had believed the universe was full of peaceful beings and that predators like the Kresh were rare. She had learned in the past few days that her people were wrong about many things. Jake said that his people had learned a long time ago that the universe was dangerous, but that did not mean you stopped helping others. It just meant you learned to fight. The Kresh found them after 90 minutes, which was faster than Danny had predicted, and showed that Vask was a better hunter than Jake had hoped. The 2 warships entered the nebula with their sensors sweeping through the clouds, and Jake watched their approach on the one working monitor that Lisa had managed to restore. His hands were steady on the controls, but his mouth was dry and his heart beat with a rhythm that felt too fast and too slow at the same time. Danny came to the bridge and said that the jump drive was ready, but that using it would definitely destroy the engines and leave them stranded wherever they ended up. He also said that the life support was failing faster than expected because of the hull breaches, and they had maybe 6 hours of breathable air left. Lisa asked if they should try to jump now before the Kresh got closer, and Jake shook his head because jumping blind into unknown space was just another way to die. The Kresh ships moved closer and their weapons powered up, and Jake could see on the sensors that they were preparing for a final attack. Vask's voice came over the comm, and he sounded almost sad when he said that Jake's resistance had been admirable, but that all hunts ended the same way. He said that the creche would remember the human who fought for alien children, and that Jake's name would be spoken with respect in creche territory. Jake opened a channel and his voice was rough from exhaustion and stress. He said that he did not want creche respect, and that he did not care if they remembered his name. All he cared about was keeping 3 children safe, and if that meant dying in a broken ship in the middle of nowhere, then that was acceptable. Vask was quiet for a long moment and then said that he truly did not understand humans and that such dedication to non-kin was foreign to creche. Thinking, Jake said that was the difference between humans and creche. Humans had learned that protecting the vulnerable made the whole group stronger and that children deserved protection regardless of whose children they were. Vask said that such thinking made humans weak, and Jake laughed and said that Vask should look at which ship was still fighting and which ships had been damaged or disabled by a cargo freighter with 1 gun. The creche commander did not respond to that, and Jake watched the warships move into position for their final attack. He reached out and activated the external speakers, which was something that cargo ships had for communicating with dock workers during loading operations. The speakers were not designed to broadcast into vacuum, but sound could travel through debris fields and nebula, gas if you amplified it enough. Jake took a deep breath and then made a sound that started deep in his chest and rose through his throat. It was a growl that turned into a snarl, and it was the sound that his ancestors had made when they faced threats that were bigger and stronger and more dangerous. It was the sound of a human who had decided that retreat was not an option and that death was preferable to surrender. The sound carried through the nebula and the creche ships picked it up on their sensors. Vask appeared on the screen and his expression was different now. The predatory confidence was still there, but underneath it was something else that might have been confusion or might have been the first stirring of doubt. Jake opened a channel and spoke with a voice that was cold and certain and completely without fear because he had already accepted what was coming, and acceptance brought its own kind of strength. He told Vask that humans came from a world where being prey meant death and that his species had spent millions of years learning how to stop being prey. He said that humans had hunted mammoths with wooden spears and that they had tracked prey across continents on foot. He said that every predator on Earth had either learned to fear humans or had gone extinct, and that the ones humans liked were turned into pets that lived in their homes. They said that humans were persistence hunters who could run their prey to death under the sun, and that they remembered grudges for generations. He said that Vask had made a mistake when he decided to hunt the Verdani children, because those children were under human protection now, and humans did not give up what they protected. He said that even if Vask killed him, today there would be others who heard this story and they would remember what the creche had done. He said that humans would remember Vask's name and his pack and his species, and they would remember for years and decades and centuries. He said that humans had a phrase for when someone threatened their children, and the phrase was that you had made an enemy for life. Jake said that Vask had not made one enemy, but had made an enemy of an entire species that held grudges and never forgot. The speech should have sounded ridiculous coming from a man in a dying ship with no weapons and no hope, but somehow it did not. Jake's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction, and the creche, who had spent their lives hunting prey, heard something in that voice that made old instincts wake up and whisper warnings. Vask stared at the screen and his claws flexed against his command chair. The creche ships opened fire and Jake tried to maneuver, but the ship was too damaged and the plasma bolts hammered into the hull. The lights went out and emergency systems kicked in and bathed everything in red. Danny screamed that they had lost main power and that life support was failing. Lisa held onto her console as the ship shook apart around them, and Jake reached for the jump drive controls because dying here was certain, but jumping might give them a chance. His fingers touched the activation switch, and then something impossible happened. The long-range sensors, which should have been dead, suddenly lit up with new contacts. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system, and they were big and they were moving fast, and their transponder codes identified them as human military vessels. Jake stared at the readouts and could not understand what he was seeing because the cavalry did not arrive in real life and miracles did not happen to cargo pilots who made stupid decisions. Lisa looked at the same readouts and started laughing or crying or both at once. She said that the distress beacon they had activated 3 hours ago had finally reached the nearest military outpost, and that the Colonial Defense Force had scrambled a response fleet. Danny pulled up the ship identification and counted. 12 warships led by a carrier that was 10 times the size of the Kresh vessels. The Kresh ships immediately broke off their attack and tried to run, but the human fleet had already surrounded them. A voice came over the open channel and identified herself as Captain Helen Price of the carrier Valiant. She said that she had been monitoring the situation since arriving in the system and that she had heard every word of Jake's confrontation with the Kresh. Her voice was calm, but underneath it was steel and ice. Captain. Price said that threatening children in human space was not acceptable, and that the Kresh pack had made a serious mistake. She gave them one chance to surrender and power down their weapons or face the full response of the Colonial Defense Force. Vask appeared on the screen and his earlier confidence was gone. He said that the Kresh were not in human space and that this was neutral territory. Captain Price said that any place where humans found children in danger became human. Space by default, the Kresh tried to fight and lasted about 3 minutes before their ships were disabled by coordinated fire from the human fleet. The warships were not destroyed, but their weapons and engines were surgically removed by precision strikes that showed exactly how outmatched the Kresh had been from the start. Vask and his crew were taken into custody, and their ships were placed under guard while the human fleet secured the area. Captain Price contacted Jake directly and asked about his ship's status and the condition of his crew. Jake tried to give a professional report, but his voice cracked halfway through and he had to stop and breathe for a moment. The captain said that medical ships were on their way, and that the Verdani children would be safe now. She said that Jake had done well and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stand up even when standing up seemed pointless. Jake sat back in his command chair and felt all the tension drain out of his body and leave him shaking and weak. Lisa came over and hugged him hard enough to hurt, and Danny appeared on the bridge and clapped Jake on the shoulder with a hand that trembled. The three of them sat together in the damaged bridge and did not speak because there were no words for what they had just survived. The oldest Verdani girl came out of the crew quarters and walked slowly to where Jake sat. She looked at him with those huge crystal eyes, and then climbed into his lap and put her small arms around his neck. She spoke in Universal and said that he had kept his promise and that the Verdani would never forget what he had done. Jake held her carefully and felt the two younger children press against his legs and realized he was crying. 3 weeks passed before Jake was allowed to leave the hospital on Earth, and by that time the story of what happened in the Calaris system had spread across human space and beyond. He woke up on the morning of his discharge and found news reports playing on the small screen in his room, and every channel seemed to be talking about the cargo captain who faced down Kresh hunters to protect alien children. Jake watched for a few minutes and then turned off the screen because hearing strangers talk about him made his skin itch. The doctors came and ran their final tests and said that his injuries had healed well, but that he should take it easy for a few more weeks. Jake nodded and signed the discharge papers and got dressed in clothes that Lisa had brought from his apartment. She came to collect him, and they walked through the hospital corridors while people stared and whispered, and a few even tried to take pictures. Lisa steered him through the crowd and out to a waiting car that took them to a government building in the capital. Ambassador Kelvin Torres met them in a conference room that had windows overlooking the city and walls covered with art from a dozen different alien species. The ambassador was tall and thin and had the kind of face that gave nothing away. He shook Jake's hand and thanked him for coming and gestured for him to sit at the large table. Jake sat and felt like a small child called to the principal's office. Torres explained the political situation that had developed since the incident. The Verdani government had reached out immediately to thank humanity and offer full trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Other species that had suffered under Kresh predation were sending diplomatic inquiries about possible protection arrangements. The Kresh Collective had sent official emissaries to Earth seeking to understand the species that had challenged their fundamental beliefs about predator and prey relationships. Jake listened and tried to process the fact that his decision to help 3 children had somehow changed the political landscape of this entire region of space. Torres said that the Verdani were offering to pay for all damages to Jake's ship and to compensate him for lost work and medical expenses. Several human corporations were fighting over who got to sponsor him and turn his story into entertainment. The Colonial Defense Force wanted to offer him a commission and a position training pilots in unconventional combat tactics. The ambassador paused and looked at Jake with something that might have been sympathy. He said that Jake's life would never be completely normal again, because the story of what he did would follow him everywhere. Torres asked if Jake had thought about what he wanted to do next and how he wanted to handle the attention. Jake said that he just wanted to go back to flying cargo routes with his crew and to be left alone. Torres nodded and said he would do what he could to facilitate that, but that Jake should prepare for people treating him differently. He handed over a datapad with information about the various offers and opportunities and told Jake to take his time deciding what he wanted. Jake took the datapad and promised to look at it and then asked the question that had been bothering him since he woke up in the hospital. He asked where the 3 Verdani children were and if they were safe. The ambassador smiled for the first time and said that the children were staying at the Verdani embassy under the care of their diplomatic staff. He said that they had been asking about Jake every day and that they wanted to see him before returning to their home world. Torres said that if Jake wanted, he could visit them this afternoon. Jake said yes before the ambassador even finished the sentence. The Verdani embassy was beautiful in a way that human buildings were not because it incorporated living plants into the structure and the walls seemed to glow with soft light. Jake walked through the entrance with Lisa beside him, and they were greeted by a Verdani diplomat who introduced herself as Ambassador Kira. She led them through corridors that curved in impossible ways to a garden area where the 3 children were playing with what looked like holographic toys. The youngest boy saw Jake first and made a sound of pure joy before running across the garden and throwing himself at Jake's legs. Jake caught him and lifted him up, and the boy wrapped his arms around Jake's neck and chattered in his own language. The 2 girls came over more slowly, but their faces showed the same happiness. The oldest girl, whose name Jake had learned was Lyra, stood in front of him and spoke in Universal that had improved dramatically in 3 weeks. Lyra said that the Verdani Council had declared Jake to be clan kin, which was an honor reserved for those who had saved Verdani lives at great personal risk. She said that by their law and their hearts he was now pack-father to the 3 of them, and that connection would last for all of their lives. She reached into a pocket and pulled out a small crystal pendant carved with symbols that Jake did not recognize but could feel were important. The girl placed the pendant in Jake's hand and explained that it was a family marker and that wearing it meant he accepted the bond between them. Jake looked at the crystal and felt his throat get tight. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the children and said that he would be honored to accept. Lyra smiled, and it was the first time Jake had seen any of them smile, and it transformed her whole face. The younger girl, whose name was Mina, asked if Jake would come visit them on their home world, and Jake said yes without thinking about the logistics or the time it would take. The boy, whose name was Pim, asked if Jake would tell them stories about Earth and about humans, and Jake laughed and said he could do that. They sat together in the garden, and Jake talked about his home world while the children listened with the kind of attention that children everywhere gave to stories about new and wonderful things. Hours passed, and eventually Ambassador Kira came to say that it was time for Jake to leave because the children needed rest. The goodbye was hard and involved a lot of hugging and promises to stay in contact. Jake walked out of the embassy with the crystal pendant in his pocket and his eyes burning with tears that he refused to let fall until he was back in the car with Lisa. She did not say anything and just handed him tissues and let him cry while the car drove them back to his apartment. When they arrived, she helped him inside and made tea, and they sat in his small kitchen while the sun set outside the windows. Lisa asked if he regretted what he had done, and Jake said no. She asked if he was prepared for how his life had changed, and Jake said he had no choice but to adapt. Danny came by later with food and updates about the ship. The Colonial Defense Force had not just repaired the damage but had upgraded nearly every system and added actual defensive weapons that were way beyond what a cargo freighter should have. Danny was excited about the improvements and went on for an hour about power couplings and shield generators, while Jake ate and listened and felt normal for the first time in weeks. The story of Jake Morrison and the Horizon's Edge continued to spread across the galaxy like a virus that no one could stop. The tale was told in 1,000 different languages on 100 different worlds. Some versions were accurate and some were exaggerated, but all of them carried the same core message. Humans were the species that protected the weak and snarled back at predators and became absolutely irrational when something triggered their protective instincts. The galactic community began to understand something about humanity that had not been clear before. Humans were not the strongest species or the most advanced or the longest lived, but they had something that made them dangerous in their own way. When a human decided something was under their protection, logic and self-preservation became secondary to an almost primal need to defend. Scientists studied it and called it the human response. Psychologists tried to explain it as a remnant of pack behavior from human evolution. Philosophers debated whether it was a strength or a weakness, but everyone agreed that it was real and that it was something to be aware of when dealing with humans. The Kresh Collective sent a formal delegation to Earth 6 months after the incident, and they met with human leaders to discuss what had happened. The Kresh admitted that their encounter with Jake Morrison had shaken their understanding of the galaxy. They had always believed that they were apex predators and that no species would stand against them when it came to matters of the hunt. But Jake had stood against them and had been willing to die to protect 3 children that were not even his species. The Kresh delegation said that they needed to understand why, and the human diplomats tried to explain about empathy and morality, and the human tendency to adopt anything that needed protecting. The Kresh listened, and slowly began to grasp that perhaps the doctrine of Fang was not the only way to view the universe. Jake returned to flying cargo routes after 2 months of recovery and dealing with interviews and ceremonies. The Horizons. Edge was better than ever, and Lisa and Danny were still with him because they were family in all the ways that mattered. They took jobs that carried them across human space and sometimes beyond, and everywhere they went, people recognized Jake and wanted to hear the story from him directly. He got better at telling it over time, though he never embellished or made himself sound braver than he had been. He always emphasized that he had been terrified and certain he was going to die, and that the only reason he survived was blind luck and the arrival of the Colonial Defense Force.